Alright guys, so we're going to talk about unwrapping. So I'm going to do the crate first, just because it's fairly simple and stuff like that. And then I'll do at least a chunk of the monitors and kind of talk a little bit about that. So I have my crate that I did. This is my high poly of my crate. Again, this is a pretty simple mesh. And I did my low poly. So I did my low poly in two parts. I did my main body, and then I also did the handles as separate parts, and we'll kind of talk about why I did those in separate pieces. Anyway, so this is pretty much it. My low poly again, not too crazy. It just kind of covers all the things I need. It has insets where I need insets to be. If you find any weird faceting, we'll talk about that when we start baking too. It's not a big deal right now. Or not faceting, but just kind of smooth and group stuff. Faceting you don't want at this point. So let's begin unwrapping. So let's just hide all our high poly stuff because I don't need it at all. So first thing I do is you guys will have possibly more than two sections, right? I have the body and the handles. You might have a crap ton of stuff, right? And that's okay. So we'll look at the monitors. The monitors, I have like a ton of different objects. First thing I'll do is just unwrap them all separate. Don't worry about them being together or their scale or how they're going to fit together on the page. Just unwrap them. That's all you got to worry about. So go in here and add a Unwrap UVW modifier. Okay, and we'll open it up here. There's a little Open UV editor there. So I've already unwrapped this guy primarily, aside from this cylinder bit here. If we just ignore that for a second. Alright, so let's ignore that for a bit. So in the end, once you're done your unwrap and we're ready to bake, this is what you want it to look like. Number one, it should be as clean and as flat as possible. It needs to fit into this one square. You can't have things outside of here for your bakes. It all needs to fit in there. And you have a couple goals with your unwrap. Number one is to prevent things like stretching. All right, we'll talk a little bit about that once we're unwrapping. Number two, you want to use as much space as you can on this texture stuff. You want to give each thing as much space as it possibly can, which means you got to pack it in here really, really well. And to do that, you're going to need to find really good ways to flatten your stuff out. The last thing you want is like things that are slightly curved, really weird shapes if you can't prevent them, because things that are flat and straight will bake out a lot nicer. If you imagine something that's straight on and we're trying to render pixels for this thing, pixels can line up to a straight line perfectly, right? Because they just go up and down or left and right. If you have something, I have this element here and it's on a slight angle, let's like that, for instance. Well, that means your texture is gonna start looking like this this anti-alias little line here. It's gonna need a half a pixel for this and a half a pixel for the next corner, and you're gonna get an offset, and then your shit's gonna start looking really low resolution. You're gonna waste a lot of res because your stuff is on slight angles. So you want things to be as nice and crisp and even as possible. And last but not least, and this is not a very hard part to deal with, but we will talk about it, is your entire object needs to have the same resolution across the board. So once you're working on your object, there's a little pull down here, and you can pick your checker pattern, and we'll add a checker pattern to your mesh. I don't know, it's not showing it for me right now. Yeah, there we go. So to show a little checker pattern, you can do the other one with the colors and stuff too. But if you notice, all of these squares, no matter where they are more or less the same size. You can fudge things a little bit. Obviously, this part on top is not right. This is the kind of stuff that you will need to avoid, and that's where the checkers come in handy. This is stretching, and it will make your stuff look really bad. If we look at this cylinder here, its density of squares is way higher than everything else here, which means it's going to get way more resolution, but it's a tiny little bit on the mesh, which is also very wrong. So you're going to want things to be nice and even. We'll talk about how to get that and whatnot. that's the general kind of rule of thumb anyways for props. If you're working on something really big, then you want to prioritize resolution based on where the player is going to see stuff. So if you have things that are going to be really far away from the player, really small, you can kind of change the resolution a bit. But typically when we work on characters or other props, we want things to be nice and even across the board. And probably one of your hardest jobs, especially when you start getting into things that are a bit more organic, like characters and stuff like that, is where to put seams. Seams are the worst part, right? That's your bane of your existence for unwrapping. Now, you're going to have seams. You can't get around it. It's impossible to not have seams, especially on something complicated like a character or even this guy here. It's going to be your job to hide those seams as best as you can. And that means tucking them away in places that already have seams in the texture. Let's say if you're working on a character and they have a seam along their pants on the side where like it folds in, we'll put your actual unwrap seam in there. Because if those textures don't perfectly align, if there's a little bit of an edge there, you won't notice it because it's supposed to be a little bit different. You know, sometimes you can't get away with stuff. Sometimes you got to put them right on edges, right? You know, if I wanted to, I could build some sort of crease into this crate along the side and then put my seams in there, but I'm just kind of working on the corners. So anyways, that's kind of like a quick overview of just some of the things that you should be thinking about and focusing on when you're doing your unwrap. But now let's talk a little bit about workflow. So I know a lot of people get a little bit overwhelmed with unwrapping because it's pretty bananas. But it's really not that big of a deal. You just have to be kind of systematic about it and just kind of chill and kind of understand, again, that what you're doing will work out in the end. So probably when you start, your mesh will not look like this. It will probably, all your pieces will be all over the place. They'll be stretched across here. You know, they'll be doing all this kind of stuff, right? Your stuff's probably going to look something like this, right? It's just going to be all crazy because when you were unwrapping or building your stuff, it was moving around your UVs and all that shit. So it's going to look really, really bad. So the first thing I do is I go into the face mode here, face select mode on the bottom. Make sure I click off just somewhere away from my mesh, off on the viewport or off over here. And I go to mapping, flatten mapping, and just hit OK on this by default. So what this will do is, if you haven't used flat mapping before, is it will take every 45 degrees of your mesh and extract faces based on 45-degree angles and separate them out. And it will do like a little flat map on each of those chunks. So if I do 45 degrees, you'll see here it tried to do anything that aligned within its 45-degree kind of angle there. So that's, you know, that was obviously right. So it did this whole thing as a whole, and it's like, oh, this thing maybe belongs to this part of the mesh, so or on its own. So it kind of tries to decide its best guess of like how to move things around, and it doesn't do a really good job of like picking things, right? So flat mapping, you know, is like the basic way of just getting your stuff clean, right? The last thing you ever want to do is flat map and be done with it, right? This is not a good unwrap. There's, you know, weird seams everywhere, right? Tons of green lines. Not very good. When you go into Unity or other programs and you select generate light maps for your mesh, this is basically what it does. Is it just goes, yeah, cool, you know, flat map. It might even increase the threshold. Some engines have an option to do that. So this one picked 66 degrees. Did a much nicer job. Picked some good meshes, right? You know, did this whole top part there. And this is kind of what it would do for your light map. So it's, again, it didn't do a bad job, but hell, look at all this wasted space. Tons of wasted space, right? You got, you know, if we turn this off here, we got all this space here that has no mesh here at all. And that's part of your texture. You're going to have to import that into your engine. It's just going to be black, right? So flat mapping, again, good way to start, bad way to actually live your life. So, but anyways, flat map your stuff and just throw it off into the side. This is typically what I do. I leave my center square just kind of blank for now, and I just kind of move my shit out of the way. And then what I'll do is I'll start looking at my mesh and I'll start assessing. I'll be like, okay, well, what things do I want to be stitched together possibly? So I know this bottom piece here, you know, aside from these guys, you know, maybe I can even leave those on, but probably not. Probably just these guys here, these meshes. This is just the bottom of my crate. I know I want a seam right around that thing because it's barely ever going to be seen. It's going to be touching the ground. So I'm going to select these guys here. I'm going to hit my D button, which is detach, or you can go to Tools and break. Is it break?
Control B.
Oh, thought there was detach. Is that what it is? Break? Oh, maybe I have my shortcut set up on D. Yeah, so I must be using. I think I'm using. Oh yeah, there it is. Detach edgewards. There's my D there. I think I set that up myself, but they do have their own shortcut. So by hitting D or Control D, whatever it is, it just detaches your stuff. If you don't do it and you try and move your things, well, it's going to try and bring all that along there because it's just naturally mapped together. So I'm going to take this. I'm just going to move this over to the side because this part of the mesh is done. Right? It's flat. It's over. That's it. Same with this top edge here. You know, I might want those edges, but I will probably just keep these as is. So it's not attached to anything, so it's fine as is, and I will move it over to the side. So top and bottom of my mesh is finished. Now let's talk about the rest of my stuff. So I kind of do the biggest things I can first, just to get them out of the way, right? So I have this face right here, maybe even this top guy here. Looks like it looks like 3D Max already stitched a bunch of this stuff for me together. So we did all of that. That's looking pretty good. That's exactly kind of what I want it to be like. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use these rotation snaps up here. I'm going to rotate this to kind of orient it the same way it is on the mesh, just for my own mental stability. I'm just going to do it that way. So this little edge is on the top, and this bigger polys on there, right? That way I'm not flipping my stuff around, right? So if I hit to the left of this guy, it'll select that. To the right of this guy, it'll select that. Now, the thing that messes people up, I think, with unwrapping a lot is the idea that this shape can be different than this shape, right? This is a representation of this mesh, but it doesn't mean it is this mesh, right? I can select these guys here and then start moving them along. And now this face here is super long, but now it's making this texture really thin. All you're doing is saying, what do I want to be inside of this polygon? So if I already had a texture in here and it was bark or bricks or whatever, you know, how many bricks do I want in here? And you can stretch this stuff along. So these two things are kind of detached. You can have seams on this that aren't on this, and you kind of have to understand that they're two separate entities, but they work together. One of the best ways I've heard unwrapping kind of explained, if you really need like a good real world explanation of it, is clothing. A friend of mine was trying to talk to his grandma one day about what he does for a living, and she was older. She has no idea what gaming is, right? And so he was trying to explain to her what he does for a living, and she had no idea. And then they were chatting for a while, and she was talking about clothing, and he's like, "Oh, yeah, you make clothes. That is a good part of my job, right? I have a certain amount of space, like material, like cloth, right, which is your square." And I need to cut out shapes for clothing, for t-shirts, for boxes, whatever it is, that then I can wrap around something and then find ways to stitch them together to make a 3D shape like a shirt or pants or whatever, you know, dog costume. And that's really what you're doing, is you're cutting out shapes to then wrap around this object and make clothing for it. And like shirts and pants and all that, you're going to need seams. There's going to be places you stitch it together. And if you imagine making clothing out of something that has zero stretch to it, some material that is flexible, you can move it around and bend it easily, but you cannot stretch it. Something like, if you're really strong, you can manipulate metal, but you couldn't actually stretch it at all. That's kind of what you're dealing with. You want to minimize stretching as much as you can, but you also have to find the best way to kind of conform this stuff. So you're kind of making pants for all your objects, if you really want to think about it that way. So I have my mesh here. Sorry?
Bigger pants.
Yeah, just more different pants. This is crepe pants right here. Okay, so I have this guy here, and what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to stitch him to this face right here. Let's see where he is. Max did a pretty good job attaching all those things there together, which is great. So you'll see here that as I'm selecting this part, this mesh over here, or those faces, this edge is turning blue, which means that what I'm selecting attaches to this part of this mesh. So that this seam right here is what is a common denominator between those two. If I go to my edge select on the bottom here, and I select that edge right there, it will show me exactly what edge this belongs to. This edge and this edge on my mesh are the same edge, but they can exist in two places at once on the UV Unwrap. So it gets a little confusing, but you kind of just have to wrap your head around it. Now, the best way to stitch these things together is to select one of the edges that you would like to kind of keep in place, and go to Tool and Stitch Selected. Now, I have this on a shortcut as T. I use it a lot, so you should definitely make a shortcut because it's going to be like your bread and butter. I'm going to hit T, and what it's going to do is it's going to bring up this little stitch tool. Now, you see here that that polygon flew over here and attached itself to this part of the mesh. I have two options. I could have, there's a bias. I mean, I could do a couple of these things. Number one is align cluster. If I don't align it, by default, it will do that. So what it'll do is it'll take the edge you have selected, and will take the mesh that's, that belongs there, and it will align it to that edge. Right? It'll actually physically move it. If I don't do that, it will keep that whole face over there, and it will only bring over that one edge. So if I do this, it'll keep this edge over here and just bring over that one edge, which is typically not what you want. Scale clusters will try and scale this new mesh to the one I have selected. So let's do as an example here. I'm going to take this face that I have. I'm going to manually move it over here, but I'm going to scale it down really small. So now it's super tiny. You see the resolutions are really, really different on these two. But if I select this guy and go to Tools and Stitch Selected, if I don't scale it, what it's going to do is it's going to keep the scale that it was at and not try and move it up. If I do use scale clusters, then it's going to use this bias. And what this bias means is which scale from which object would you like to use? Would you like to use the object you have selected, or would you like to use the object that you want to bring over, or a little bit of both? So right now you can see that the bias is set to 0.5, and what it's done is it's taken this tiny little object, and it's scaled it up 50% to match this guy, and it's taken this edge and scaled it down to kind of try and find an average between the two. If I turn this to 0, it's going to scale that little guy up to match the scale of what I have selected, and if I turn it to 1, it's going to do the opposite. It's going to scale the thing I have selected down to the other object. So typically what you want when you first start is a bias of 0. You want to scale all the things that are coming to you and adopt your new scale. Now we see here on my mesh that this one edge here, the green line, has disappeared because there's no longer a seam there. But on the top and bottom here, I do still have some edges. I still have a little bit of green because there's seams. So if we look over here, those two aren't connected and those two aren't connected. If I select this tiny little edge over here and I hit Tool Stitch Selected again, it's going to do one of two things, and this is where the bias really comes. This is where it's really important. So I have this edge, Tool Stitch Selected. At a bias of 0, it's taking that edge that was right here and just pushing it to match this angle. Which what that's doing to this mesh here, let's take a look at where we are. So you see here, this grid here is on a bit of an angle. Let me scale this up just to get a better example of this. So I have these guys are on an angle just fine. These guys are kind of straight. So let's see what happens when I do this and I stitch selected. It's now taken this edge and conformed it perfectly to this one, which is now trying to conform itself to this unwrap, which is really good for this face, but really bad for this face, because now I have a lot of weird stretching on this. When I have two things that are on an angle like this that are sticking outwards, I basically want to stitch them on an average between the two. So when I do Tool Stitch Selected, if I turn this to 0.5, it's going to take the average between those two angles and move them both in towards each other. And what that will do is it's going to cause a little bit of stretching on this one and a little bit of stretching on that one. And that's much better than a lot of stretching on one and no stretching on the other, right? In most cases. And so I could do that for the top as well. So select that edge, Tool, Stitch Selected, and do that. Now the other thing you're going to start noticing, and we'll kind of deal with this once we're done, but you see here that this top edge here isn't perfectly straight. But in my mesh, I know those things are perfectly aligned, they're nice and straight and even. And you want to, as best, try and represent your mesh in the UV Unwrap as best as you can. So we're going to flatten those out later, but kind of keep an eye on that. So I'm going to keep doing this. I'm going to select my next edge here. I'm going to go Tool, Stitch Selected, Bias of 0. I'm going to fix up these little edges here, add a bias of 0.5. And one more, 0. Once you kind of get a good hang of this and you become kind of a pro of unwrapping, you'll kind of do things a little bit systematically. So I will do all my 0 bias stitching first, and then I'll do my 0.5 bias switching later, so I don't have to kind of keep going back and forth. Alright, so I'm not quite sure why it's not showing it, but I've gone all the way around. So I've stitched my entire mesh here. I only have one seam along this one edge, which is great. It's exactly what I want. When I select this edge, this one should turn blue. I don't know why it's not turning blue. Sometimes Max just decides. There you go. If I select that one turns blue. But if I select this one, that one doesn't turn blue. I don't know why. It's Max. Max is dumb sometimes. So now I've come full circle, right? This is now a rounded mesh that is flattened out. If I try and stitch this, it's going to try and stitch those two together, and obviously there's nothing you can do to make that stitch. It's impossible, right? We'd have to have some sort of timey-wimey magic to make that work, so it's not going to work. But this is as good as it's getting. Now, I might take a look here. You see how these squares are a little bit longer than these ones? So let's take a look at which face that is. That's this one here. So that means that this width of this face here doesn't actually represent the proper width of this in like the geospace. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to move this a little bit. If you can hold Shift to snap yourself to left and right, up and down movement, I'm just going to eyeball that a little bit. It seems like it did that to all of them. It did that because when it did the flat mapping at first, it did on 66-degree angles, right? Because I did the higher one, which typically I don't do. I stick to 45. So let me show you something kind of interesting here. So if we take a look at this square here, this face straight on, it's stretched, right? If we look at this face straight on, it's nice and even. If we look at this one stretched on, or straight on, it's stretched. But if I look at it from this angle, they're all perfectly even, because that's how it took it. It took a perfect degree angle and just took everything and just projected an unwrap onto that. So it messed up some of that, right? So then it's your job. I know it's really trippy, right?
Yeah.
And then eventually it's just like straight on. It's your job to catch these little mistakes that Max does and fix them. So now I'm going to select all the verts over here, and I'm going to just move them, and only moving, right? That way I'm preserving my unwrap from my other assets, or my other like faces, whatever, or assets. Doesn't have to be perfect. Just you could eyeball it. Nothing wrong with that. So this section is pretty much done. The only thing we have here is these edges here aren't perfectly straight. And just like modeling, I can go into my edge select, and sometimes I can double click if they are all together, like this one here. And over here on quick transforms, there's this little guy here called align horizontally to pivot, and that one there vertically to pivot. What that'll do is it'll take whatever you have selected and scale it all the way down on its, kind of like you would on mesh, right? So if we do that, it's going to, if you kind of see it, it actually straightened it all out. It's the same with this one here. I just click that, and it'll just scale it down. That way it's perfectly straight, and I know it matches my mesh as best as I can. Now, if you can't double click and do a loop or a ring, you always manually select some verts and do that. So that part's done, nice and easy. Really different resolutions because I scaled them around. Totally do not worry about that. Max has an auto tool to fix all that, which is great. You don't have to worry about that manually, because otherwise that would be a nightmare. All right, so let's do another part. So I'm going to take this guy. I'm just going to move him over to the side because he's done. I just want him out of the way. So now I know I only have this left to do, this left to unwrap. So that's what's left. So I'm going to do this guy here because he looks really easy. So I'm going to take this. I'm going to do the same thing I did before. I'm going to rotate it to kind of match the alignment of the of what it is on the mesh. I'm going to do the same thing. So I'm just going to grab edges. Oh, make sure your element select's not on, because your stitch selected won't work properly. So same thing. I'm going to do a 0 bias, stitch selected, stitch selected, and this is typically how I unwrap. I just do stitch select on everything that's a zero bias really quick, and try and just get it out of the way.
What is that tool called in the user interface?
In here, it's called stitch selected.
Is it?
Yeah. You'll have to go under, or you try to make a shortcut for it.
Yeah.
You'll have to pick the UVW Unwrap UVW modifier, and then in there it should be called stitch selected.
Yeah, under I've got stitch average, stitch dialog.
Oh,
stitch distance.
sorry, stitch dialog. It is called something different in there. You're right. Good question. Okay, so now we have a new problem here. I have this this part of my mesh here. Let's take a look at it. That I would like to stitch flatly onto this. It took this entire bottom piece and it just mapped it from the bottom, right? It just, because it's like, yeah, that's 66 degrees, whatever. I'm just gonna do a projection mapping on this part. And so it stitched all of this together for me. And obviously these proportions aren't right. Look how tiny this triangle is to this one here. I don't like it. So if you ever don't like what Max did for you, just select whatever you want to fix up, undo, and you can just go map, flat map, and do a threshold of 0. What a threshold of 0 will do, why won't you let me right click on that? Can I right click on everything else? Is it will basically unwrap each face or each angle on its own. Right, so now I have these guys are on their own, these little corners are on their own. It did every degree on its own, right? Which is just a pain in the butt sometimes, but sometimes you really need that. So what I have here is I've flat mapped this this guy here. I've stitched them all together. Now what I want to do is take these faces and stitch them onto this, right? Because I want to kind of have it wrapped around. I want to eliminate as many seams as I can. So I'm going to select this edge right here, right? And if I hit, I don't even need to look where that other face is because I know I flat mapped it at 0, so it's perfectly to scale and on its own. And I'm going to hit T, stitch select at 0, and it's going to bring that face over to me. I'm going to do that to all of these guys. So now this one edge here, I don't know why the hell, but I have a ton of cuts on it. Don't ask me why. I didn't clean it up before, which is fine. I'm going to go clean it up at some point. But what you can do is, if I select one single edge, I can do stitch select and it will bring over that whole thing. As long as they're all properly to scale, it'll align them. The pain in the butt is, you'll see here, there's no seam there, but there's still a seam right here. And even though they're exactly over top of each other, sometimes when you bake, that seam will still kind of come out, which sucks. So instead of doing that, I'm going to undo. And I'm actually going to select all of these edges and hit stitch selected, which will allow me to stitch all of that at once. Sometimes that works terribly. If it's something a little bit more complicated, sometimes it works really well. And now I'm going to do the same thing for these in-between areas. I'm going to do stitch selected. And that's brought over that triangle piece there to all those corners. And now I can do a stitch selected on this. And brought that over. Now I can decide whether I want to, a bit of stretching is acceptable on this part, right? So I can leave this as a seam and it's going to stay nice and properly proportioned and all that shit. Or I can select one of these guys and at a bias of 0.5, I can kind of average them out. Right? I'm going to get a bit of a squiggle because it's skewed that mesh and it's doing some weird stuff. It's up to me if that squiggle is okay, right? Sometimes you got to decide as an artist whether a bit of distortion or stretching or whatever is better or worse than a seam, all right? And sometimes you won't know until you bake something, and that sucks, right? I'm going to leave it. It's a pretty bad squiggle, but that's the problem with UVs. Sometimes you can't fix stuff like that. It's either seam or distortion. You can't have both a lot of times, right? So I'm just going to stitch these guys. Now, sometimes you'll come to a problem like this. I've only averaged the one side of this because this guy no longer has anything to average against it, right? I have nothing to stitch it to, because if I try and stitch it, it's going to stitch to this side, which kind of sucks for my mesh. There's a bit of a workaround. It's really dumb. I'm going to do this guy first, just so I don't have anything else to worry about. Okay, we're going to go over here. I'm going to select this face right here. This edge right here is exactly how I want it. It's average between those two. It's perfect, right? I'm going to hit D on this and detach it. I'm going to go all the way over here, and I'm going to stitch it on this side as a 0. And now I have something to average this to. I know it's really dumb, but now I can do a 0.5, and I can average all of these. And this is fine, because I know this angle matches this perfectly, and they're the same, so I've kind of done one side, brought it over, and then fixed it up. It's weird and it's kind of dumb, and that's the kind of stuff you got to get your head around, because I know it doesn't make a lot of actual like mesh modeling sense, but unwrapping is like a whole different dimension, right? Just certain physics things do not apply from from modeling. So I'm going to do the same thing I did on my other guy, because these edges here are really screwed up. They're a bit wobbly, so I'm going to double click them and then use this flat map, flat little utility here to do that. So now if I select this guy, this whole thing is done, and I can move them over to the side. So I'm going to do the same thing for all these guys. This guy here is like a little ring there. I might leave him as is for now. He's gonna. The problem with things like this, right? I only have, excuse me, this one little edge around here. The problem with leaving him like this is A, he's like, I'm gonna get a seam around there, which is okay, but he's gonna waste a lot of space because he's a friggin' ring, and there's all this shit in the middle here. And yeah, once I unwrap stuff, I can put stuff in the middle, but it's a stupid shape to have to deal with, right? So you can leave him if you want, or I bring this guy back, and I'm going to take this guy and I'm going to break him up myself, a little bit manually. So I'm going to just select, let's say these two. I'm just going to hit D to detach them. What I'm going to do is I'm going to stitch them to the bottom of this, just to kind of straighten it out a little bit. You can't do a lot if you're trying to stitch multiple things together. Oh, that worked like a horse's ass. There we go. Sometimes you just got to do one at a time. And what I might actually do is also just attach these triangles, little wedge things, and I'm just going to stitch them to this part here. So hit D to detach them, so they were no longer attached to that guy. Stitch them there. If you ever do stitch something that's only like one edge, and you see that there's a green edge here, if you just click on it once, there's two edges over top of each other there. Just click once and you'll select one of them. It doesn't really matter which one. And then you hit T and stitch them. One cool thing that Unwrap does is when I stitch these guys, it will naturally stitch those as well, because there's nothing else for them to do. They can't exist in two spaces at once if their neighbor has finally been welded. So it'll kind of fix that. So you can always do every other edge if you're ever in that kind of predicament. And then I can still, if I want to, I can even these out if I feel, that's worthwhile. And if I'm okay with some more stretching, I can go through and average these guys out as well. Up to you, right? All depends. Now, what we have here, I'm gonna have to do the same thing as I did for the bottom bit, which is fine. I can do that later. So now we have a bunch of stretching in here, but look at that shit. There's like no seams on this whole thing, right? There's just a seam on the one side here, nice and clean and pretty. Definitely not free. It will cause me other problems, but I'm going to bake it. I'm going to see what it's like. And if I find that it's shitty, I'm going to go through and undo some of those. I'm going to remap this thing and kind of break it up a little bit more and then deal with seams. But again, sometimes you just gotta try it out. So I'm going to do the same thing for the rest of these. So I got this guy. It did just like a top map projection on this, which is probably good enough for what these guys are. And I'm just going to stitch this stuff up. So stitch, and then where's this belong to? This is over here. Stitch and stitch, so I have a bunch of green stuff in here, so I want to just go through, and this is why a shortcut's really nice, because you can hit your shortcut and then spacebar to hit OK. And it'll keep whatever bias you had from before. So if I set a bias of 0.5, from now on, every time I hit stitch tool and whatever, it'll keep this bias. So if I change this to 0, from now on, when I hit this, it'll stay at 0 until I change it again. So it's kind of nice. So nice thing about having it on a shortcut is you can do this shit really, really fast, because then it's just whatever spacebar, like T spacebar, T spacebar. And this one I want, oops, this one I want at a 0.5 because I want to average out these two. All right, this one, these guys I might go and flat them out because I know this is a corner of my mesh. So I know all these things are like fairly evenly spaced and they're all straight on. So I want to use that flatten tool to do that because the flat map did not do a good job of trying to keep these nice and straight. Oops. Flatten that out. Alright, and then I'll do the same thing. I will start stitching these guys. So if you see here, by default on the flat map, Max took this whole side here and just flat mapped it all as one piece, which is great. Nice, no stretching, but kind of a waste, but maybe not. I might just leave this as is because these corners are a pain to deal with, and L's or C's like this aren't too bad to kind of fit into your mesh. So I'm going to continue. When you are unwrapping, make sure you save constantly because stitching stuff will definitely crash Max once in a while. Now, I don't know why and who decided this in a board meeting, but Control S while you have Unwrap open does not save your file. Yeah.
Nope. That's useful.
Doesn't do shit. I don't know what the fuck it does. I think it does something.
Stupid soft selection.
I don't even know. I have no idea what it does.
I don't know why they decided to
Yeah, so you have to go file and save. Otherwise, you're shit out of luck. Really friggin' stupid. No idea whose decision that was. Should be fired. Hopefully it was. They need to undo it. Anyway, so keep that in mind. And then I have my little cylinder up top here, so I can stitch him up too. And then the edges of the cylinder, I'm just going to leave as is. All right, they're going to need that seam there. So I'm done. This is all I got to do for my mesh. Now, to get them all in that square, all I have to do is, well, not all I have to do, but number one, some of this shit is all scaled differently, right? This thing's all scaled differently than that, right? I got, what the hell was that?
That would be my battery that just came.
Cool. So I'm just going to scale this stuff around just for good measure. So it's all scaled, all really wonky. If you go into your Unwrap tool here, there's these guys here, Arrange Elements. If you click on one of these, Pack Normalize, Pack Together, Pack Custom, whichever one you want to use, Rescale Elements. If you click on one of those, it'll put it into the square for you, and it'll scale them all to their real-world scales relative to each other. As long as your mesh is X-formed. If it's not X-formed, it will not do that. Make sure you X-form your mesh. I should have started with that whole thing before you go. So once you pack it, or once you hit one of those guys, it'll scale them all properly together. From now on, if you need to scale anything, scale everything. If I start scaling individual things to try and fit them in here, it'll start ruining my scale. You can do that by about 10% or so without too many issues. But from now on, you got to start scaling together. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to optimize this space as best as you can. Obviously, because these guys are stitched in such a long fashion, basically this is as big as I could make everything, right? Because these guys can't go any longer. Which then you have to make your next choice. What is more important than to you? Another seam on your mesh or more resolution? And in this case, you want the res because this is a big, giant waste of space. So you're going to have to take these guys and you're going to have to just pick a seam somewhere, like that, and just hit D, attach them as two. And now, if you repack them, you'll see it's using a lot more space. Your next job is to pack all this stuff together. Now, before you start packing things, if you have multiple objects, I have my handles and I have this. I'm going to need to pack my handles and this into one square without overlaps. So right now, I'm not going to be too worried about actually packing this right now until I finished unwrapping all of my stuff. Once you're done unwrapping everything, I'm going to collapse this down. Say my handles are unwrapped as well, which I think I did. Yeah, there are my handles, nice and straight. What you can do is you can attach these two things together and then pack them. Or if you want to keep them as separate meshes for baking and stuff like that, select all of your meshes together. You can select as many meshes as you want, and you can add a modifier on top of both of them together. When you do that, when you open this up, it will have both of my things in here. It will have my handles and all the other stuff I unwrapped, which is nice. I can work on these things together and still keep them separate actual meshes. So I'm going to do this again. I'm going to pack these guys to get all their scales correct. Yeah, I just threw them in the corner there. That's nice. You can click that little box there if the grid bugs you. I really hate the grid sometimes. Now comes the fun part. Now comes puzzle time, which is kind of awful, but I really enjoy it. Now comes to the time where you need to pack all of these into the square as best as you friggin' can. And what that means is I can scale this up a little if I want. Maybe I'll scale it up a lot. Is start taking advantage of some of the space. Now, when you're packing things together, they cannot be right on top of each other. You have to leave some space, and don't leave too little, because too little you can get bleeding between textures. If this part's red, this part's green, you can get a little bit of green and red on either one because if your resolution isn't high enough. So make sure you leave a bit of space, and leave a little bit of space on the outside of your square. Don't pack it right to the edges like that. Just a little bit of buffer. Not as much as Max will do for you by default, but a little bit like that. So yeah, now I got to start playing around. I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to put these two in here. Now I got these stupid C shapes. Maybe I can put my C in here, and then maybe I can use my rotate. You rotate these guys around as long as they're on a 90-degree angle as best as you can. Right? You start trying to find a puzzle. It's basically a little puzzle. How can I best fit this stuff together? The other thing you should keep in mind when you are packing your things is try and keep elements together. So I know this little bit and these two edges are part of that little cylinder on top. I'm going to try and keep them close by. Because when I'm painting them, if I want this little cylinder to be purple, I don't want to have to be putting purple over here and over here and over there, because then you got to find your shit. Try and keep them together, right?
Like Cube Guy from sci-fi.
Yeah, like Cube Guy. Yeah, totally. Yeah. So, you can keep them there. I mean, to a certain degree, sometimes not much you can do. You got to kind of move stuff around. Now I've scaled my stuff too big. I know I can't actually fit all my stuff into this square at the scale they are. So I'm going to have to scale everything down. This is kind of a pain in the butt. So usually what I'll do is I'll pack things to one corner. These things can stay outside, but when I do this scale tool will stay inside at least that corner, and I can uniformly scale from this end. So I can scale it a little bit and then start trying to pack this in other ways, right? So I'm like, okay, well, I want that to be there, so and again, 10%, you could do a little bit of stretching and squashing, a little bit of a different change, not too much. But sometimes if you're like, you know what, these things just don't friggin' fit in here, I'm just going to smoosh them a little bit of smooshing, not bad. Right? You got to be careful, but You know, and then you're like, yeah, you know what, maybe these C's are causing me some problems here. Maybe if these guys were on their own, they would fit better. And then I can be like, hey, you know what? This is the under part of my crate. This crate's probably never going to be upside down, or hardly ever, right? So maybe I could scale this one down just a little bit more than the top, have a little bit less resolution, but probably won't be a big deal, all right, as long as I know how I'm going to be placing my crate, or I know how other people are going to be placing it. Right, and so right now I've overlapped this cylinder with this thing, and you cannot have any overlap. You have to make sure you move all your stuff. Every single element of your mesh needs to be A, inside this box, and B, have its own unique part of the square. No overlapping, nothing like that, even if they're the same type of object. So this feels pretty good. I feel like I have still a lot of wasted space up here, so I might spend a little bit more time trying to fix this up if I can, if I feel I can somehow. I don't know if I can. There might not be anything I could do about this. It might just be, you know, shit out of luck. But sometimes there is ways, right? Sometimes you just gotta be, you know, what happens if I move this over here? Like, oh, that's a lot more space, but then, you know, how the hell do I fit these friggin' C's in here somewhere still? So maybe I go back to my original plan of having one of these crates in here. Right, maybe pack them in like that. And what do I have? A lot of space over here. So just by moving that around, I now have been able to scale this up a little bit more. All right, and it's funny, but I mean that's like an extra, you know, pixel or two across this whole thing, which doesn't sound like a lot, but can go from being a blurry line to being a fairly crisp line. And yeah, it's stupid. It's a stupid job, but it's kind of fun. It's kind of like sadistic fun where you kind of hate it, but it grows on you, and then you miss it while you're sleeping. So when I was working at SK, we had a lot of unwrapping to do. We did a lot of mesh building from other textures and other meshes, so we had a lot of unwrapping, not a lot of like custom work. There was a point in my life where I had unwrapping dreams, where I was just, in my dream, I was just packing things into this square. And it was friggin' crazy, batshit crazy stuff. It was awesome. So I can even take this guy, and even though I know he's the same, I can probably smush him in here. Sometimes you got to make the sacrifice to have these things further apart for the sake
That's
of,
where I know they're going, okay,
Yeah,
I
a little
can
bit.
finish it.
yeah.
This is the point where I say my mom would probably be better at this than me.
Yeah, I feel they can outsource this as like an app,
Yeah.
right? Be like, hey, yeah, you know, it's like a free-to-play whatever, right? Like, oh, you got to pack these in there. Oh, you did it. You did the level. But it's just meshes. There's just new games every day, but it's just meshes from other things. And then at the end, you're like, congrats, you got a credit on Halo. Like, oh, shit. This is way better than Candy Crush. Anyways, and then so I can scale this back up.
Or hey,
And bam.
here's that new skin you've been wanting.
Yeah, exactly. And then I can convert this back to an edible poly, and these meshes are still separate. Yeah, and then when I open up this guy on his own, it's going to look really, really wasteful, right? It's like, I'm going to bake an entire texture just for that. But what's going to happen is we're going to bake the crate, and we're going to bake the handles, and then in Photoshop, we're going to mush them together, right? And the reason we're going to do that is to prevent some other problems. We'll deal with that when we're baking. But
That's like unwanted shadows and
exactly, things crisscrossing, like projecting across and shit like that. So it happens. But anyways, that's your kind of goal where you guys should be at. Try and get as far into unwrapping for next week as you can. I want to spend the class helping you guys with any actual unwrap problems and getting through them. Because as you guys probably saw, it's kind of silly. I'm going to do a video of me unwrapping the monitors for something a bit more complicated, dealing with more multiple mesh things and things that are a little bit harder to unwrap than a box. So we'll talk about that. So try for next week, try and get as much of it done as you can. Even if it just means unwrapping all your separate meshes on their own and then packing them in class, that's cool. So that's it. Thanks, guys.